So welcome everybody. This is our sixth, I think, presentation this semester in the in our seminar series on resilience in food and health supply chains. And I'm really happy to welcome Joanne Zieger from MIT Sloan School of Management. She's the Maurice F. Strong Career Development Professor and Assistant Professor of Operations Management. So she's coming to us from a operations management, operations research background, and her research focuses on the design of operational strategies, technological innovations, and algorithms to advance social and environmental impact in informal, first mile, and global supply chains. And so as we've had some talks already from the people who work on food systems, and in particular food systems in sometimes in developing countries, I thought this was very interesting to get Joanne's perspective from an engineering perspective on the things that she's doing. And so I'll turn it over to you, Joanne. Welcome.
Thanks. Yeah, can I have a show of hands really quickly to get a sense of who's in the room, of who has a bit of an OM or OR background? Like if you were to use your blue hand or use your yes button in this. Okay. And who comes perhaps more from kind of either one of the schools that are more environmental sciences or social sciences, coming from like anthropology and okay, great. So I'm probably missing in that case others, but so I come from a mix of these two backgrounds as well. My PhD was an interdisciplinary PhD between the School of Environmental Sciences and the School of Business, and particularly in operations management. So I'm mentioning this because this is where this research really started, that I'm presenting today on kind of designing platforms and algorithms to optimize these informal supply chains. It really started in my PhD when I was looking at this topic of sustainable sourcing in global supply chains. And so that was especially determined at the time to kind of understand why we're making so little progress in practice with moving forward on sustainable sourcing, despite all the lofty goals that were being put forth in the private sector. I was interested at the time really in palm oil because it was kind of the elephant in the room when you talk about sustainable sourcing. And I was interested in Indonesia because that is the elephant in the room for palm oil. It produces over half of the global palm oil in the world. And so to be able to try to understand what was going on, I went to the field to get a sense for myself and understand why people weren't changing their behaviors, or why we're not able to understand their behaviors, etc. So I did this, really went in the field in kind of most literal sense of the word, spending kind of weeks on end in some of the most remote parts of Indonesia. This kind of was also including a ton of data collection. So I was trying to collect data on thousands of smallholder farmers in these palm oil supply chains. And over time, we were starting to be able to kind of digitize some of this data and get a better sense of some of the patterns of where are people located, how do they make decisions on where to sell, how can you influence those decisions, etc. How can we change their behavior on their sustainability practices? But all of this data set, was just giving us a cross-sectional data set. So we were getting a ton of data in terms of number of farmers and their behaviors and their decisions and their preferences and things like that, their economics. But that a week later, that data would probably already be outdated because these environments are highly dynamic. Some of you who work in kind of these settings in the first mile developing country would probably know what I'm talking about. These are hyperdynamic environments that evolve really quickly. And so it was very hard for me to get a good sense of what was going on kind of in a timely manner. So as I was studying these supply chains, right, the main kind of brick wall that I was hitting all the time was this complete lack of digitization in these first mile supply chains, including palm oil. So there was no digitization of transactions, of prices. There were no records of people selling or buying this stuff like the palm oil fruit. None of it was digitized. And in the case of palm oil, it meant that for about 40% of the market, we have no idea where our stuff is coming from, right? We have no idea who produced it really on the farm, where the farms are located, etc. In the case of palm oil, that had huge consequences in terms of deforestation, livelihoods, equity, efficiency in the supply chain, etc. And so if I really wanted to kind of make an impact on the ground in terms of advanced sustainability of global supply chains, I needed to start with solving this issue of digitization first, or at least try to make a dent in that, right? So while I was kind of still struggling with that issue, the other aspect of doing the field work is that I did realize there were multiple ways through which technology could actually really improve the operations on the ground. So improving the market efficiency on the ground in these informal supply chains. And so by combining these two challenges of digitization, but also the opportunity to create significant value through kind of improved operations through technology is what got me started on this initiative called PEMPEM. So the premise behind this initiative is simple. It's just saying, well, okay, well, the reason why we don't have good digitized information in some parts of the world is because in other parts of the world compared to us, like in our parts of the world, we do have good digitization, is because many of us use ERP systems, a form of an ERP system. Many companies here use a form of ERP system. And why do they use ERP systems? Well, it helps them improve their productivity, right? So the idea was, okay, if we can design an ERP system for these informal supply chains, that we can both improve their productivity in these really remote parts where we need better economics, and we can also have access to a large amount of data. We can digitize these transactions, and we can now start applying all of our analytical tools towards also solving challenges in the first mile in the informal parts of it. So that's what I did, right? So PEMPEM kind of builds a social ERP for supply chains at the base of the pyramid. So this is an initiative that got started in 2018 with a small grant from the Packard Foundation as a trial, a pilot. So this was our version number 2, and it allows us to also establish field operations in Indonesia. And in 2020, we expanded this. We now have an internal engineering team that builds much of this stuff, much of the ERP that we are deploying in Indonesia. We went from pilot to professional version, and starting branching out into collaborations with fintech so that we can also look at digital payments in these supply chains. It's currently used by over 1.5 aggregators in the supply chain. These are kind of tiny transportation middlemen, if you want to imagine kind of what kind of users they are, and they're linked to about 45,000 smallholder farmers. So here you can see kind of the journey. Like here, I was still working on the mock screens in 2018, and now you kind of, we see some of our, this is a picture of one of our, one of the users in PEMPEM. So that's kind of the background to much of the research agenda. But let me now kind of define a bit better what I mean with these informal supply chains, right? Because I've been talking about these without defining them really. And what I mean when I refer to an informal supply chain is that these are supply chains that rely for the vast majority on word-of-mouth information, word-of-mouth agreements, cash-based transactions, and they're extremely fragmented, okay? This phenomenon is not just a phenomenon in my field site, in Indonesia and in palm oil. This is really a global phenomenon. So for example, informal supply chains produce over 50% of global food calories. And this is, I think, an underestimate. Some studies would go all the way to, I'm not even going to mention some numbers, but this is on the lower end of the estimates of studies. They also produce over 20% of the critical minerals in the world, like gold, for example. For cobalt, it's a bit less, but there are many critical minerals that heavily rely on informal supply chains, informal miners. And over 60% of employment in the world, not in our countries, but in the right, in the world, across the entire world, over 60% of global employment is informally employed. This is if you include all kinds of industries. If you were to just look at agriculture, 93% of the world of employment in the agricultural sectors would be informally employed. So these are the latest numbers of the International Labour Organization. So it's a global phenomenon. And it has huge consequences for how we manage our food systems, our mineral systems, our employment, lots of really interesting implications of that. For kind of the global production systems, including food systems. So the informal nature of these supply chains leads to what I mentioned, right? The lack of digitization, and so lack of transparency, which in turn leads to economic inefficiencies, but also challenges with food insecurity, tropical deforestation, which is the second biggest emitter of global greenhouse gas emissions. And it creates a tremendous opportunities for exploitation of human beings, in a worst case scenario, leading to human trafficking. So my research works on the three kind of solid lines. I look at transparency and economic inefficiencies, human trafficking, and tropical deforestation. I don't focus as much on food insecurity, but there's really important links there as well. So in the context that I study, there's a huge complementarity between solving economic inefficiencies and reducing exploitation, as well as increasing transparency and digitization. So that's kind of the broader motivation behind this work. Now, the beauty, if you will, is that this is where the power of technology comes in, right? Technology as a tool is a really great approach to bringing fragmented supply chains together and structuring and digitizing otherwise non-digital information, right? And so in these environments, we really have to harness technology because many of the traditional methods wouldn't work in this hyper-emerging environment. So we are missing much of the traditional hardware like RFID and barcodes. We are missing softwares like ERP. Those are designed by your typical SAP or Salesforce. Many of the people that I work with don't even own a laptop, right? So all you've got is mobile phones. And we are missing large-scale data sets, even things like reliable road data. So there's a whole kind of stream of work I'm working on looking at, well, Google Maps in rural Indonesia is unreliable. Even OpenStreetMap isn't that reliable. So how do we provide optimal road recommendations if this basic data is unreliable, right? How can we digitize the roads better? So all we've really got as a starting point is a lot of paper-based evidence and people who only use mobile phones to coordinate their decision-making amongst the peoples in their networks, right? This is kind of the broader setting. What I'd like to do for kind of the remainder of this talk is look at a bit more in depth at one element of this, which is the issue of word-of-mouth information. And some work that I'm doing in that area. But before I go there, I wanted to just see if there's any questions or clarification points or. No questions. Okay. The work I want to talk a bit about today is around this issue of word of mouth information, right? So this is based on, like, most of it is based on one paper that's called Crowdsourcing Market Information from Competitors. It's joined with my co-author Irene Lowe, who's at Stanford. And this is kind of one of the first papers that's really using and leveraging data from the PEMPEM platform that we developed to draw some insights into kind of the realities on the ground based on data and introduce this kind of relatively novel problem to the field of operations management. So this is how things are typically being recorded, right, as an example. And so now we're going to try to use some data from the platform to motivate some research questions. So here's an example of what information access looks like in smallholder supply chains based on data from Indonesia. Okay, so I'm showing you a subset of the data because otherwise things become difficult to visualize. But here is, you can imagine on the left-hand side, each dot on the left-hand side is a firm, right, in an informal supply chain who would like to sell his stuff to a buyer who is each dot on the right. Okay, so in this case, it's palm oil that they want to sell. So a firm on the left would like to sell palm fruit to a buyer on the right. Okay. Each link between these two is an information link, meaning that this this seller has access to price information from this buyer. The second one has access to price information from this one buyer. The third one is a bit better connected in this network and has access to 3 sources of information. And then you can go through kind of all of these guys. In this case, I'm showing you a random subset of 70 firms and 43 buyers. On average, across these links, each firm is connected to 2 buyers. Okay, so this is based on our data from Indonesia. So on average, each firm will have access to information, commercial price information from 2 buyers in their network. Okay, the way they get this information is through SMS communication or through WhatsApp. Now, why is this important? Well, if you look at that in practice, what are they missing out on? Well, if you look at the prices are associated with these buyers, and you look at, okay, well, they on average have access to 2 buyers. How many buyers would be of practical interest to them? Meaning, how many buyers are as closely located as the 2 buyers that they are currently connected to? That's on average about 7 buyers. And if you look at those 7 buyers who are of practical interest, the price differences between them are huge. They're still pretty big. So on average, between these buyers, the average price difference is still about 4% across days and firms, and it would be up to 10% price difference for 1 in 10 days. Okay, so there's still a huge opportunity to improve revenues for these guys if we can provide them with better price information. And because it immediately affects, because it's a pretty low margin business, the impact on revenue immediately translates to a pretty big impact on profits. So the question here that we were looking at is, okay, well, how can we increase widespread access to market information in these kind of smallholder supply chains? I should probably say I didn't define my smallholder supply chain. If any of you is unfamiliar with the smallholder supply chain, please let me know. If not, I'm going to move on. So these are supply chains. Okay, yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, what do you mean by smallholder?
Great. So because I put together this talk based on a couple of different talks, so I just realized I didn't formally define this. A smallholder, I'm referring to a smallholder farmer. So a smallholder farmer would, I think the official definition is still own less than 2 hectares, but let's say between 2 and 5 hectares they would own. And so in many cases, smallholder supply chains are informal. They rely on this word of mouth information, word of mouth agreements and things like that. So in this case, because I'm looking at palm oil, I'm looking at smallholder cases because most of them are smallholder farmers and rely on transportation middlemen and etc. So when I refer to a smallholder supply chain, I refer from the supply chain to smallholder, transportation middleman, processor.
Okay. And if since I have you here, how many smallholders do you typically deal with, and then how many buyers are there that they're dealing with?
Right. So in this case, so in the 3-tier, you would have, let's say, 1 buyer who would be linked to about let's say it's a 1 to 40. I would say it's about a 1 to. So it would have 40 smallholder farmers per middleman. And I'm just computing the number of middlemen now per buyer. It's probably in the region of 100 to 200. So something like that. But like one of the things that we're doing is we're starting to quantify these things. But this would be giving you an order of magnitude. And so in this case, when I'm referring to the firms here, I'm really looking at right now in this particular paper, we are looking at the piece of the supply chain from the transportation middleman to the processor. That's kind of the one that we're focusing on in this paper. Great.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, this is great questions because then we can make sure everyone's on the same boat. Okay, so then the question is, how can we increase this widespread access to market information, given that currently they rely on this word of mouth, and there's value to be gained from increasing that information set. So there's been, with the kind of growth in mobile phones in the developing world, there has been kind of a unique opportunity to provide centralized access to information to a whole lot of people, right? And then disseminate this information through mobile phones. So there are other platforms like Loop, Reuters Marketlight, and Kudu. I'm not sure if some of you are familiar with any of these three. So these are some platforms who have started to emerge to share kind of market information via mobile phone communication, right? But a key challenge for these platforms is really how do you efficiently source the information that you would like to disseminate to the crowd, right? You need to have it somewhere before you can share it. And the only ones who currently have that information in many cases, in many informal settings, are the ones who are the firms themselves. Like I showed before, like all of them in this slide, on the right-hand side, the firms on the left-hand side together have access to 43 buyers, but each of them individually on average would have only access to 2, right? So the crowd is really powerful in this case, so we need to be able to get that information because in many cases they're the only ones who have it, right? Now, previous literature in this has often assumed that a third party can somehow manually collect this information for the platform. So, for example, in the case of Reuters Marketlight, they would send out agents to the mandis in India every day to go and collect market prices, and they will then become available in the platform the next day, and there would be kind of a high enough correlation over time to make that interesting. So in this paper, we study an alternative model, which is really around crowdsourcing because of what I mentioned, right? And what's interesting is that the crowd here are firms, right? In the supply chain setting, the crowd are firms who are competing with each other. These are micro entrepreneurs, each of them a transportation middleman, that is competing with another transportation middleman. And so they might not want to share that information with the platform, even though they could benefit from information shared by someone else, right? And so it brings up an interesting question of how do you incentivize that, right? So there's a large literature in operations management on kind of optimal information provision for maximizing welfare when you're a platform. So this includes kind of how do you optimize the provision of information so you can optimally solicit information from the crowd, even in a non-competitive setting. And so this is both in these platform literature like TripAdvisor and Yelp would be mentioned as examples, but also in markets for information. This is a bit more kind of in the econ literature where there's whole studies on markets for information. So one insight from this literature in general is that you, as a platform, you probably do not want to reveal all of the information you've got when there is strategic interaction. You might need to be strategic in what you're revealing as information in order to get the kinds of behaviors that you would like. There's also a whole empirical literature that's much more focused on development economics. And has kind of examined the impact of introducing a mobile phone. So we're kind of one step later. This is a literature that's about a decade old, as you can see. So this is looking at, you're at a state where you have no mobile phones, you introduce mobile phones in the population, what's happening to welfare prices and things like that, right? The interesting thing is that the consensus isn't entirely clear on things like welfare. Farmer welfare. On prices, it's a bit more clear. We see kind of the law of one price operating in practice. With welfare, it's not entirely clear. And what's interesting is that if you look at the operations management literature, you might get a sense for why. It's essentially, you might not want to reveal all the information you've got because some people might actually be worse off if you do so. These are some of the stuff that already exists. I think in terms of this last literature, we're taking it one step further. We're saying, okay, well, the state that we start out with is one where people have mobile phones, they have WhatsApp and SMS. Now we're introducing some smart applications, right? Can we improve upon the state that they were in before? So this is the research question is then to look at, okay, well, how can a platform crowdsource information from and disclose information to competing firms? And I see that time is ticking by really, really fast. So I'm going to have to be super brief about this. But so the original approach we're using in this paper is one where we are using typical operations management tools of game theory and optimization. And so our model approach, so we first model this problem, and the way we model it is that we are going to model firms who are playing a game with each other, deciding whether or not to share information with each other. So it's an information sharing game between these competing firms. There's uncertainty around this, so it's a stochastic game because we have price uncertainty. Prices vary over time. And we consider this game over an infinite horizon. So they play forever with each other, okay? And this game is mediated through this information sharing platform, right? So this information sharing platform can make certain decisions on what people are either allowed to do or able to see. So it can come in between and mediate that. So these firms, they would all have heterogeneous access to, so before the platform, they would each have access to market information in their own ways, right? So as you saw in my example, they all have information from a certain fixed subset of buyers, and it's heterogeneous across them, right? And then they can decide whether or not to share their private information with the platform. They then sell to the profit maximizing buyer in their information set. So in the set of information they have access to. Before the platform, it's just their private set. With the platform, it's the set that includes the information shared by the platform. And they would all compete on market share, okay? So they compete for farmers in this case. And the platform's objective is what? Well, it aims to create and improve firm utility, meaning it tries to improve the utility for all firms. And the way it tries to do that is by enlarging their information set, right? So this is a non-trivial question, right? Because as the platform tries to improve the utility for one firm by sharing market information with it, the platform could be decreasing the utility of a second firm. For example, if the value of the market information it offers to one firm is larger than the value of the market information it offers to a second firm, then now this first firm is going to benefit disproportionately from the platform, and it's going to be able to steal market share from the second one because it's able to offer better prices to the farmers. The farmers find that more attractive. Over time, they will switch to the guy who's able to provide them a better deal. So the platform needs to somehow balance the increasing value that it offers to all firms on the platform in order to make everyone better off. And why is that the case? Purely because of competition, right? So if there was no competition, it wouldn't be as much of an issue. So I'm glad I put in kind of a preview of results. So some of the results that we established here in this paper is that first off, we confirm that a naive platform design where you just disclose all of the information that is shared with you back with the competing crowd will not guarantee, there will be no guarantees that all firms will actually benefit if they were even to share with you. And there's no guarantees that they even will share that information with you, okay? So we can all come up with settings where in fact they will share everything and everyone will be better off, but there's just no guarantee that it will be true in every single setting that you can imagine, right? It will depend on the settings, and I will be able to say something about that. But there's no guarantees that a platform like that is a smart thing to do in a setting where firms are competing with each other. We do show, however, this is the good news, that you can design a platform well. You can come up with an appropriate policy for the platform, meaning a guideline for how the platform should be disclosing information over time to all of these firms. In such a way that everyone would benefit and everyone would strictly enlarge their information set. And what we prove is that we prove that such a policy exists, and then we also construct an example set of policies. And we have some analysis on what we can say about those policies. The policies that we identified is what we call balancing policies. So what balancing policies do is they disclose information partially. So meaning the platform will disclose information partially to the firms, and it will do it in such a manner that it can balance the market shares, or an alternative, if you want to think about it differently, it's almost equivalent, is that it's going to try to balance the price increases that people can get through the additional information. So that's kind of the high level takeaway from that, from how we were able to do this. We can talk about algorithms to do this later, because that's some of the work that we're still working on. And the other element of this disclosure policy is that we are incentivizing people to share information with the platform by essentially making your access to information to others, your balanced access to information from others, conditional on you actually sharing with the platform, right? So if you don't share, you don't get access to the information that we would be willing to share with you. So this is kind of giving them an incentive to actually share information with the platform. Now, on a kind of, in terms of properties, one of the things that we show is that this set of policies, so a set of kind of guidelines that you can follow as a platform, has a particular mathematical structure called a lattice. And this structure allows us to say something about which policies are better than others in a particular ordering. And the ordering here is we want to be able to share as much information as possible with as many people as possible. So we're using some mathematical structures to be able to identify where that's possible and how do we do that. One of the takeaways is that what I mentioned before, which is that the degree of competition and information endowments will really determine the degree of disclosure. So let me clarify this, right? So if you have what we show is that if you have a very competitive market and the information endowments are hugely asymmetric, now you have to be, as a platform, you're going to have to be very careful about who you share information with, in order to not create huge asymmetries in the market. But if the degree of competition is close to zero, or information endowments are very symmetric, you could probably share all information with everyone and it would be totally fine, right? So a setting where people are not competing with each other and we're a crowd of consumers as opposed to a crowd of firms, would be captured by the setting, and it would just say, okay, show all the information to everyone. So that would be fine. However, it does capture settings where that's not the case, and we need to be a bit more careful, right? The fact that this is a balancing policy, and so what we're trying to do as a platform is to balance kind of the price increases that everyone gets, or the market shares that they have, allows us to, that's a relatively interpretable policy, meaning that we can imagine what that means. Like we, as human beings, we don't need to rely on math to be able to imagine what that means. We can perfectly picture what this means. We can interpret it. And so what it allows us to do is to design heuristics to implement this in practice. Chris, I think I'm late on time with this, so I'm not sure I have time to go through the actual details of this. Do I?
So I think you're doing fine. I mean, if it takes, we have until 5, and as long as we have, 10 minutes or so for questions at the end, I think you'll be fine.
Okay. Cool. So are there any questions on this so far? Otherwise, I'll walk through a couple of examples to make it a bit more explicit. So here, one thing I should say is I'm not very good at monitoring the chat. So I see there's a 1 on the chat, but okay, good. I think that's you, Chris. Thanks. So on this first point, right, that you might not want to disclose all information as a platform, let me illustrate this through an example. Because I was making this point that if you were to do this, then we don't have any guarantees that all firms would benefit if they were to share, and not all firms would share, right? So let me give you an example. So let's consider that we have 2 firms, and we have 3 buyers, okay? And this firm is currently connected to, each firm is connected to their buyer of the same sub index. So I think I'm actually in front of my screen right now. So let me make myself a bit smaller. Okay, so each firm is connected to the buyer of the same index. Okay, and each of these buyers, they have certain prices. In this case, I'm just going to make it simple. They each have a certain price realization. Okay, two price realizations, sorry. So we can be in a state of the world where the price vector is as follows, or in a state of the world where the price vector is as follows. By the way, they are also connected to the buyer of index number 3, right? So transportation middleman 1 is connected to buyer 1 and 3, and firm number 2 is connected to buyer 2 and 3. Okay. They also have a cost vector, meaning that if this firm is selling to each one of these buyers, then he has a cost of 4 to sell to buyer 1, 0 to buyer 2, and 0 to buyer 3. Okay. And they make a per unit profit, okay, of the price minus the cost. This is a simplifying assumption. It's just one example. So what happens now if there is no sharing of information, right? There's no sharing of information. Well, the first firm is going to be able to, in this state of the world, be able to make a maximum per unit profit of 2. In the state of the world, it will be 1, right? So 5 minus 4 is 1. 4 4 he's not connected to, and then 0 minus 0 is 0, right? So that's how we get this vector. Same thing for the second firm. We can go through the same exercise. He would make a per unit profit that is symmetric with the first one. So it's either 1 in the first state of the world or 2 in the second state of the world, right? So this would be their per unit profit. So there's no sharing. Now there's full sharing. What happens? Now what happens is that both of them now get access to all buyers, right? And if you were to go through exactly the same exercise as I just went through, then you would essentially get the following per unit profits for each of the firms. And what you find is that the firm number 2 has a strictly higher per unit profit than 1, right? So it makes 4 in one state of the world, 5 in the other, versus this one makes 0 in the first state of the world and 4 in the second. And so firm 1 does relatively worse compared to firm 2. Okay, and I'm saying here relatively worse because overall they're still both doing better, but it's relative. And so what happens is that if firm 1 is doing relatively worse, then over time firm 2 will be able to get better per unit profits, and he will be able to get to steal market share from firm 1. He will be able to offer a better price to the farmers, and he will be able to steal market share from firm 1. So firm 1 is losing out. So what happens? Firm 1 will not want to share information with the platform, so that we are no longer in a full sharing equilibrium. We're going back to the no sharing, kind of the previous setting of no platform, right? This one. So in this case, we will not have sharing. And in fact, if they were to share, they wouldn't be both better off, right? However, there's something interesting here, which is that you can have partial sharing, right? So you can be more creative than that as firms. As a firm, you could say, well, I'm going to share partially. I'm only going to share with you under certain circumstances. So in this case, we could have that firm 1 would only share in this state of the world, right? So he will only share information on buyer 2 when we are in state of the world where the price of buyer 3 is 2. This is an example. I'm giving you an example, right? Now what happens here, if he were to follow this strategy, now the per unit profits for both firms are exactly doubling compared to the situation where there was no sharing. So with no sharing, it was 2-1, 1-2. Now it becomes 2-4, 4-2. So now both are increasing symmetrically. But this in practice, if you have thousands and thousands of transportation middlemen, it becomes really hard to coordinate amongst themselves on this, right? So this would be very hard for them to do. But so what's interesting here is that this is something that the platform could do instead, right? So the platform can now say, okay, well, it's very hard for you to coordinate on this. You would be better off if you could coordinate on this, but you can't. So let us take care of that by mimicking what you would do and do it in the platform. So that's what we're doing. Here it's partial sharing, right? But everyone sees whatever has been shared. And so what the platform is going to do is it's going to say, everyone's going to share, but everyone sees, right? So it's kind of the reverse. Instead of having everyone partially share and then see everything, we're going to say just share everything with the platform, and it's going to make sure it discloses partially in order to be able to coordinate the actions that would be better for everyone. So that's the notion behind kind of partial disclosure of the platform. So it's just going to try to mimic what you would want to do if you were able to coordinate. Okay. This is where I'm not going to go into details of the math behind this, but what we show that this exists, a policy like that, that we can construct it, and that we can find the one that's most informative, meaning the one that provides the most information to all of the firms in the platform. I just to make sure that there's enough time for this, I will skip through the policies unless someone really wants to hear more about the policies. Instead I'm gonna just focus on one policy called a grim trigger policy. And I'll focus on this one also to give you a better sense of, what does a policy mean in this case, for those of you who are not familiar with this. So here we're going to focus on what we call grim trigger policies. And we say the policy of a platform, we denoted by pi, is a group trigger policy if it is closest to a certain firm, according to, let's say, a particular rule, until the first period where the firm no longer shares information, and then it will stop disclosing to that firm. This is what I was mentioning before, it's conditional access. So it's only going to disclose information to a firm if that firm continues sharing with the platform. Because this is kind of a rule that says, it says very specifically, if you are not sharing with me anymore, I will not disclose to you at all anymore. If you're continuing to share with me, I will disclose to you according to the rule pi prime, right? So that is one, so this is making information conditional. And we're also going to focus on what we call balancing policies. What's a balancing policy? It says that this is a mathematical notation, but it's just denoting that we want to ensure that in the limit, the market shares of all firms are staying in the same ratio. Okay, you can design a similar rule to say that in the limit, you want the price increases to stay in the same ratio for everyone. So meaning that you want the per unit profits for all firms to stay in the same ratio, right? So these are some rules that we can define. And what we can then show is that these policies, the balancing grim trigger policies, the ones that balance the market shares or the per unit profit increases, they are able to ensure that all firms benefit in their utilities. So let me go in a bit more detail here. So this is saying, suppose there is a balancing grim trigger policy, and we have a vector row. So this is a vector that is of the size of number of firms in the platform. And this vector satisfies that you can disclose kind of to any given firm with a given probability, right? So this is a partial disclosure component. Well, if you do that, then you can actually improve everyone's utilities. Now, what's the intuition behind that, right? If you get what a balancing policy is, then what you get is that this policy is going to balance market shares. And so all we're now doing is we're going to increase the per unit profit while balancing market shares, right? So now everyone's better off because you've neutralized the competition effect, the market share stealing effect, the business stealing effect. You've neutralized that, and you're still increasing per unit profit, right? For everyone. So if you understand the balancing policy, now you understand why we're able to increase the utilities for all firms in the market, right? And so this is a very, ex post, it's very simple to say, well, the way you're going to get crowdsourcing from competing firms is by just ensuring that the market shares are balanced, and then everything else you can will follow. So that seems very intuitive, but ex post. In practice, you could say, well, how are you going to balance market shares, right? So that's why we have this alternative of being able to balance, increase the delta in prices. So we need to be able to balance delta in prices per unit profits. Cool. So this is, so one thing that I completely skipped over very quickly just because we haven't introduced all the notation, etc. But you can notice that this is probabilistic, right? So we're going to reveal information with some probability. So that's all part of making this work. But the higher level intuition, hopefully it's helpful. The other element here is that all we're saying in this case is say, well, sure, we can find a way to improve everyone's utilities. But what we really want to do is provide as much information as possible while still ensuring this, still ensuring incentives for people to share back with the platform, right? So what we're really interested in is something that's called the most informative disclosure policy, right? We want to be able to disclose as much as possible to all these guys. So what we do here is we use mathematical tools again. So there's a notion called a lattice. I'm kind of visually representing it here. But you can see, so you can see a policy as a mathematical object. It's an abstract object. And you can say, well, a certain policy is better than another if it shares information, if it shares more information with all firms, right? So if you define an order with this symbol on a set of policies such that one policy is better than another policy, if and only if it provides more information, so the probability of providing information is higher for all firms, right? So the probability of providing information to firm M is larger under this policy than under this vector for all firms, right? So we can define this order, and with this math, so now we have this mathematical object to policy, and we have an order, and we can say you're going to be of a higher order if you satisfy this rule, right? So what we show is that this set of policies satisfies the structure of a lattice. So it satisfies we're able to actually structure it so that we can identify the one who has the highest order, who provides the most information to the most people, right? And so that allows us to now find the algorithms to actually identify the one and implement the one that is the most informative. So, but it was important to show that it is a lattice, otherwise we can't do that. Happy to talk about these algorithms in the Q&A session. And that would be of interest. I'm going to switch a bit from the mathematical tools that we use in here, the kinds of approaches that we use, towards practical next steps. Okay. So one of them is we're rolling this out in the Pemba platform, or we're going to try to roll this out, right? And so we're moving from math to practice. And so in practice, what happens is that not only do we have firms who are posting prices to share it with their competing firms, so we also have buyers who could be posting information, for example, prices about their location. Now, in practice, for those of you who work in these environments, you'll know that these buyers aren't always trustworthy. They might have a ton of other reasons not to post information. There's a lot of information that they don't actually have, or they wouldn't be willing to share, such as corruption practices at weighing bridges, grading practices, and things like that. And so we still rely on this crowdsourcing. But we did a minute pilot looking at what happens in a market if you are paying people to share this information, right? And I'm just going to go very quickly over this graph, but it shows you essentially users on the Pemba platform who will use information that would not exist if it wasn't for crowdsourcing, right? So it shows you kind of the number of users in this pilot who only have access to information that they need. So they're actually proactively going and getting that information, and they only can access it because a competitor has shared it with them. And that's the blue line, okay? And then you have in the red the kind of people who are, these are users who are relying on information solely posted by the buyer, right? So what you can see is there is this, the competing firms are really important as a source of information compared to the buyers in this market. So this was a short pilot to kind of further help us understand, okay, what is the value of this crowdsourcing information once you run it based on a very simple thing like paying people. And paying people is imperfect for a lot of different reasons that we can talk about, but it gives us a sense of the value of crowdsourcing, right? So now what we need to do is implement a conditional access system and a partial information system. So to do that, now we suddenly get into the world of implementation around this. It requires us to be able to verify the information in real time. The way we have to do that is we ask people to upload copies of their receipt with the information on it. It has price information and volume information on it. We have to be able to digitize it in real time because these prices are kind of same day, and verify it. And then we combine this with user activity to be able to understand, okay, what is the impact of an intervention like this on their behaviors, on their welfare, on their selling decisions, etc. So we're working on deploying an experiment on this in the field in the next couple of months to test kind of how much are we improving user lives with this. So that's one. The other element of this is once you look at these questions, you're working in networks, and as you are, and the informal world has a lot of different network structures. So one of the kind of theoretical sides that we're trying to understand better is the following, right? So you can imagine two different network structures at least. And so let's say that an arrow in this case when it points from A to B, it means that A is interested in information that B has, right? So it's kind of very similar to what we had in my very initial example. So in this case, this person is interested in information that this person has, and this person is only interested in information that this person has, right? And so your information value network can look like a bridge like this, or it can look like what I would call a small world structure, which means that you're only interested in information that is very far away because you're already connected to people who are close by. So this guy will only be interested in information from a guy pretty far away, etc. Right? And so some of the relevant questions there are, well, okay, if we have a given policy, like the one that we've identified, which is just one, it's one policy that could work, does the utility of these firms improve more in a certain network structure? So in other words, could these platforms work a lot better in certain markets, right, than others? Why are some of these platforms working, and why are other platforms dying out, right? For example, like if you are launching a platform in a small world structure and you are only capturing a small part of the network, you're only capturing these guys, well, you're going to die as a platform because there's no value in the crowdsourcing of people who are just in here. So you need to immediately, as a platform, have a very big ambition and cover a large part of the market, or you're not going to be providing any value, right? So another question of relevance would be, well, if you're growing over time as a platform, you're first starting in a neighborhood or a village, and then you're going to district, provinces, etc. Does a sequence of growth really matter? Right? So if we need to ensure that people are improving at every stage of the sequence, does it matter how we start and where we end? Does it matter where we grow next, right, as a platform? Because there are these information structures that existed beforehand, right? So these are some kind of next steps from a theory perspective. But just to conclude kind of this foray into word of mouth information in these informal settings, the setting that we were looking at are these supply chains in the developing world, right, where information is spread across many micro firms. And all of them rely on this informal word of mouth process to know local market prices around them, or other sources of information. And the question we were interested in was looking at, okay, how can we increase widespread access to market information when the only ones who have access to that information to start with are firms who are competing with each other, right? And we looked at crowdsourcing, where essentially a big, the things to be careful with is that you want to make access to information conditional in order to incentivize people to share, but you need to be careful with how you then disclose information that has been shared with you in order to avoid business stealing and thereby scare everyone away from the platform. And this is there because of the competition that we have between firms, right? Things would be a lot easier if we're in a consumer setting than instead of a supply chain setting. And these strategic interactions are really key in the platform design. Through the minor examples I gave, I hope it was clear that if you're not taking that into consideration, then people will not want to share, or will be worse off if they share information. So that's it for me. I would love questions, because I think there's lots of things to discuss in this. So yeah, that's it.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Joanne. We've got a few minutes for questions, and for those of you who could stay a little bit after 5, we can stay a bit after 5. But has anybody got a first question?
Thanks for the claps.
Can you use your hand? So Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you, Joanne. On the one hand, this is a really fascinating presentation, very interesting work. But my question, in some sense, is somehow I missed something in the process here, and I've got a lot of distractions behind me, so it's a good thing I can mute. But the question is, so the platform is used, to make sure I understand correctly, it's used between transporters who are transporting palm fruit to the processing facilities. Is that correct?
The platform is much broader than that, but this paper focused on that. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess that's good to know. So, but is it somehow bringing the growers into the platform as well?
Yeah, it does. In the platform, it does. It's just in this paper, we focused on one piece of the supply chain first. Why? Because it was impossible for us to optimize the supply chain until we had, even for the growers, until we had access to price information on the buyer side. And there was no way to get it beyond building something for that piece of the supply chain. So we had to start with building something that works for that part of the supply chain. So then we have the information we need to do, for example, optimized routing for growers, optimized matching as well, because once you do matching, you need the transportation and the growers. So that's why we started there, but it's the very first one. Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know. And you'll have to excuse me. The question then is coming from a bit of ignorance on my part, but it's my understanding that many growers in Indonesia are oftentimes growing on a contract farming basis.
Oh, they're plasma.
Where they're not able, hold on, where they're not able to choose who they sell to. And so that's a one-part question. And then the second part of the question is that the case? And if so, do they really have, does the app give them much, power, if you will, to improve positions if they're,
Right. So there is a practice in Indonesia called plasma farmers, and this is out of this is kind of from the Suharto era in the late 80s. Where if you are a large plantation company, you have to kind of quote unquote subsidize certain smallholder farmers. So they have a quote unquote contract. That contract tended to be about 20 to 25 years old. So by now, many of them have promoted out of it, if you will. And they've now become the independent smallholders. So the vast majority now are independent smallholders. So kind of if you read about this, like you might have seen the independent smallholder reference, but it's true that not everyone distinguishes between that. So so we're focused on those independent smallholders.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Is there another question? We can probably squeeze in one more. So I had a question just more broadly about the PEM system. Can you talk about that system more broadly in terms of what it allows? And you said it was all cell phone based, right? So can you talk about that a bit more?
Yeah, so PEM is entirely, well, let's say smartphone, not mobile phone, right? So it's smartphone because it's an application. And I mean, the features that we build are increasing over time, right? And initially, we just had this price sharing feature that I explained today, which is crowdsourcing market information for transporters to buyers. We're now extending this to farmers as well, so they can have access to more transportation middleman prices, as well as there's aggregators in there called loading ramps. They can get access to that as well. Then there is a feature on informal loans. So for those of you who work in these environments, you probably are very familiar with the informal loans that people have. So often farmers will have a loan with their transportation guy or someone else upstream in a supply chain, or sorry, downstream in a supply chain. And those loans are just very poorly understood. We don't know what are the interest rates on them. We don't know how much are these amounts. We don't know how people repay them, when they repay them, etc. And there's also a lot of misunderstandings between people in the loan because it's not being recorded anywhere except if you're lucky in a book at the middleman's house. But in many cases, it's also just memorized. And so it's this notion of informal debt. And so what we created is, for example, an ability for people to track these informal loans and their informal debt amongst each other. And so whenever one of the two parties will upload some information on whether either a loan or a loan repayment, it will be visible in both of their ledgers, and they can both kind of monitor it and agree on it over time. That in turn leads to information on informal credit history. And some of the work that PEM is doing is working with banks to allow informal credit histories to be recognized as credit histories, right? And provide them access to formal loans. The other component of that is as people are sharing information on their transactions, which includes the price, as you saw, like we're also asking them to upload a receipt as proof. As they upload that, it creates income histories. Digital income histories that are verified with receipts, which now also are giving them income histories for formal loans from banks. So those income histories are used for that as well. Over time, like I said, we're working with fintech parties to be able to digitize payments. And once you get that, you get to reduce security issues. I mean, I know people in the region where we work that got killed because of cash. They have huge piles of cash because they're in charge of paying the aggregators. So digital payments will reduce that. It'll further increase kind of the confidence you can have in the transaction, so in the income histories and the credit histories. And it just makes things a lot easier from a physical kind of the number of steps people sometimes have to take to be able to make cash payments between all the different parties involved in a transaction, harvesters, drivers, loaders, etc. Will make it easier from that perspective. So that's another feature. That one is released kind of next month, I think. So it's really kind of it's the kinds of feature that we offer. Over time, you know, the big one from an OMOR perspective is optimized transportation and optimized matching. And to give you a preview on that, the big challenge, and I had it in one of my slides, but there was no time to talk about it, is the big challenge is the roads, right? There's no good digitization of road data in those regions. Like we're rarely, the areas where we work are very remote. There's very bad road data. So some of the stuff that PEMPM has been doing is installing GPS trackers on trucks to start collecting data on the roads. So you take a GPS trace data, convert it into road networks and even kind of road conditions. So we also have weather stations to try and understand, okay, what are the road conditions depending on the weather conditions. And so there's a whole, I'm currently working on some, on 2 papers where we are just trying to do that in the kind of circumstances that we have there. And they use that to do optimized transportation and also determine how many more trackers do we need to make this something that you can kind of have confidence in. So those are some things.
Right. Thank you. So I think this is a really interesting project, and both from the sort of informational perspective and then from the operations management and operations research, what you can start doing with that information. I'm sensitive to the time, but I do see some questions in the chat. So what I'd like to propose is that anyone who needs to go can go. Anyone who would like to stay for another few minutes, I can see 3 questions. And so I'm going to try to get those 3 questions covered. And then we'll run a little late on that. So I want to say thank you now. I'm obviously going to stay around. And if anyone has to go, please go. And if anyone who'd like to stay around, I'd welcome you to stay around. And so the first question is from Lawrence. Do you want to turn on your mic, Lawrence? Or I can just read it. So he's asking, is there, thought there was a marketing board or a growers co-op to optimize pricing. Also, why do the final consumers not consider vertical integration?
To optimize marketing boards. So I think you might be referring, Lawrence, I'm not sure if you're there, but I think you might be referring to optimize pricing. So the growers would optimize. I'm not sure. So in this supply chain, the growers are unable to really set prices. They can just they're price takers. But I think you might say that they might get together in cooperatives to be able to increase their bargaining power. So that idea of them organizing as co-ops is not something that we're working on. It's not highly popular. There's some trauma in Indonesia with cooperatives, especially with palm oil cooperatives. I can talk for a long time about the kinds of abuse that has happened with cooperatives in rural Indonesia for palm oil. But what we are working on is towards what I mentioned with optimized transportation, optimized matching, is that we can, by pooling growers together, so farmers together, we can, through optimized matching, provide them a better price. And to give you kind of a very visual reason for this, one of the days I was kind of following a truck. So I was literally kind of on a motorbike, just following him around to understand his decision process and his stops and his life. And we would drive on a long road, and it had like a ton of farmers who had the fruit ready, like along the road. He would pick up from like one farmer and like kind of 2 kilometers further another farmer, and would drive all the way back to a whole different region and pick fruit up there, right? And he wouldn't be picking up all the fruit from that road and ask his buddy to go and pick up all the fruit from that road. Why? Because these farmers weren't connected to him. These farmers don't live necessarily on that farm. The harvester is the one who might be present. How that fruit is being picked up and by who is completely informally organized, right? So because of that, it has huge inefficiencies, because they are not organized as an entire market. They're organized on a one-on-one basis, right? And so some of what we would be able to do is be able to optimize that, right? And group these farmers together and bundle them into kind of into bundles of fruit, and that would and they would optimize kind of that routing problem. So that's hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I think that's great. And so then there's a question about blockchain, especially I guess with the fintech aspect to this. How do you think blockchain-based platforms can change the access to market information?
change the widespread access to the market. I mean, we've talked about blockchain in PEMPEM, but the blockchain system is in the end, it's a technology, right? It's a how do you store the information? The real thing about blockchain is how do you store the information? It has to be distributed storage. A different component of blockchain that isn't really kind of the fundamentals of blockchain, but is often talked about is not distributed storage, but it's distributed sourcing of information, right? Or distributed ledgers as well. So the storage, and then there is ledgers and who gets access to what. And so, for example, if you think about our informal loan tracking feature, we have distributed ledgers. Now we have two people who have to approve that this piece of information is correct, and then it will get uploaded into their ledgers, right? And they have both approved it. So now we have two gatekeepers, if you will, to that piece of information. But that information is stored into PEMPEM's central database. It is not stored into two different mobile phones and that's it. It's stored in a central database, right? So in that sense, it's not strictly a blockchain approach. But it's, you know, it's all about storage and approvals, even if you wanted. I think that we can make that possible. To me, the key is how do you get access to the information to start with, right? So it's garbage in, garbage out, right? And so for access to market information, there is first off getting that information, sourcing it, right? And then how you store it, I think is you know, it's a somewhat separate question. But perhaps in situations where people have more confidence in distributed storage, then that could help. If they don't want to have confidence in a single party like PEMPEM, they say we don't trust PEMPEM, we only trust a distributed storage system. That's what it would help. And so one thing I found really interesting, some of the conversations I've been having with people in PEMPEM is around even like the Bitcoin technology. Why Bitcoin? Because in many of these markets, people don't trust our governments. They've had dictatorial governments in the past. They are evading taxes for a very good reason sometimes. And so they want to have their transactions protected. It's one big reason why people sometimes go into the informal economy. So how do you preserve their privacy, right, with these transactions? And some of these cryptocurrencies could be really interesting from that perspective. I think, yeah, the role of blockchain and cryptocurrencies comes in play when there's these trust issues on the central system. Okay.
And one last question, this was about the cultural differences. How would you extend this work to other countries? And do you see, for example, would word of mouth impact be different? So have you thought at all about beyond Indonesia?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, currently we're looking at doing this work in cacao. There's also people who have reached out and said, hey, can we do this in gold mining in Peru, right? So it's a very different setting. But the beauty of it is that the word of mouth, the word of mouth challenges for information, for agreements, the fragmented nature, the cash-based transactions, those are almost universal across all of these systems. I think trust is the big difficulty, and even in Indonesia and palm oil, that's a big difficulty. There is kind of a bit of a taboo around transparency, right? There is, even when we opened up the market by providing price information to different players with PEMPEM, you have to do it very carefully. You have to somewhat respect existing rules, but not enough to that you still need to disrupt it enough. So finding the balance there is where it really relies on field work and field connections and local organizations who notice. So that might change, but the fundamentals of the issues that are created with word of mouth are across. So I mentioned a couple of different commodities, but also in human trafficking, we're doing some work in Thailand and Myanmar. I mean, now it's a bit harder with what's happening in Myanmar, but we were starting to set up a whole program on reducing these word of mouth issues that lead into forced labor, right? So if people are recruited onto a vessel, but it's going through like 4 levels of informal brokers where none of the contracts are recorded, none of the debt is recorded, it leads to huge issues with bonded labor, right? And thereby forced labor. So it's really these problems and what you can do about it through these platforms and are very broad, but I think the details will lie in kind of some of these kind of where do you start, who do you engage with first, what is the level of trust or what's the level of openness. These things are much more local.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think this has been an amazing presentation, and it brings up a lot of the things that we've been talking about. And as you started asking about who was in anthropology and who was on more the engineering side of things, I think this was a really great talk to kind of bring these issues together. So I want to thank you for joining us, and hopefully we're going to be contacting you again in the future, because I think we're interested in a lot of the same things.
Great, sounds good. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks everyone for the great questions.
Bye.
Bye. Take care.